who is going to present her work on a palimpsestic set of panels and investigation into the materials, techniques, and historical context of Fathers of the Church at Chastleton House.
Thank you, Siwei. I'm just fiddling with the screen here. Can everyone hear me? My computer seems to be a bit slow.
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. Okay. Hi all, I'm Alex Chipkin, and today I'll be presenting my third year project, a palimpsestic set of panels, which was a technical and historical study of the Fathers of the Church, a set of late 16th, early 17th century panel paintings from Chastleton House, a National Trust property in West Oxfordshire. There are 3 paintings in the set: Pope Gregory I, St. Jerome, and St. Augustine, Bishop of Hippo. St. Ambrose would have been the 4th in the set, but is now missing. At the time of this project, 2 of the 3 paintings were being conserved. Each were in various states of completion. The composition of each of the paintings is based on engravings after Flemish artist Martin de Vos, and the Catholic subject matter rouses questions about the impetus for the painting's creation and their presence in Chastleton House. The aims of this project were to contextualize the paintings historically and physically, and to narrow down a time frame in which each of the paintings might have been made. In this presentation, I will focus on the main findings of my project: the set's connection with Chastleton House, how the prints and paintings relate to each other, how the paintings relate to each other within the set as well as to contemporary works, and what images were allowed to be made and displayed in post-Reformation England. Chastleton House was built by Walter Jones, a lawyer whose family had gained its wealth in the wool trade. Walter Jones bought the estate in 1602 from the infamous Robert Catesby, the mastermind behind the gunpowder plot. Oddly, Catesby was allowed to live in the house after it was sold, until 1605, when he was executed for attempting to kill King James I. Jones then demolished all previous structures on the estate and began to build the quintessentially Jacobean manor house that stands on the land today. And in 1613, he moved in. The Fathers of the Church currently hang in the corridor leading from the Great Hall to the Great Parlor on the ground floor. In around 1955, they were on the first floor and were an intact set of 4. It is unknown whether the Fathers of the Church were actually indigenous to the house. They could have come from other properties that the Jones family owned in Whitmore, Worcester, or London, or even from Robert Catesby's property. It's also possible that the paintings were acquired by later descendants living in the house. The Fathers of the Church have been linked to a set of engravings by South Netherlandish printmaker Peter Courtauld, dating to around 1565 to 1580. They are after designs by Martin de Vos, who worked in Antwerp around the same time. Here's the full set, which includes St. Ambrose, which gives us an idea of how the 4th painting in the set might have looked. The date at which the prints were produced, as well as when they came to England, can help to determine the earliest date at which the paintings could have been painted. According to historians, painted portrait sets became popular in the 1590s, along with portrait engravings, which were becoming accessible in England at the time. The source prints could have traveled to England in a book of miscellaneous engravings, like the Thesaurus, published by Dutch engraver Gerard de Jode. The book included biblical engravings after designs by Martin de Vos, and the 1585 imprint seen here includes engravings of the Fathers of the Church. A similar book was published by London-based Thomas Trevelyan in 1603, 1608, and 1616. Many of the engravings in this book were also after designs by Martin de Vos. And of these, the majority were numerical series, such as the 5 senses, the 4 continents, and the 4 ages of man. It's possible that the 4 Fathers of the Church could have been included as well. Despite the strong similarities between the engravings and the paintings, there were some noticeable differences. Some of these are the staff of Pope Gregory, which has changed to a cross with a crucifixion on top, the brooch, which has changed from Archangel Michael to a crucifixion, as well as St. Catherine on the lapel, which has changed to a male saint, and has changed position, and the bookstand lacks seraphim. And I'll just quickly show you the differences between the other two paintings and their source prints. Upon first observation of Pope Gregory, which was the most damaged in the set, it became clear that there were changes made to the pictorial layers, as seen through losses. Infrared imaging, X-radiography, and inspection of the painting surface under the microscope revealed that each painting had been painted over in many areas. The multiple compositions at times appeared to be pentimenti, and other times separate campaigns by a different hand. Within each painting, the compositions appear to have been painted in close time to one another, as cross-sections suggest that there is no dirt or surface coating between the layers, and the particle sizes of the pigments within each layer are similar. The comparison of Pope Gregory with the engraving led to the idea that the work may have initially looked more like the source print. It became clear that Pope Gregory's chasuble had first been positioned over the proper right shoulder, revealing a pink lining. This pink lining also continued under the proper left hand, which is seen in X-ray. Underneath the initial positioning of the chasuble is an orange-red colored hand, the index finger extended, seen in X-ray and through losses. Beneath the hand is a long white angular form. When compared with the engraving, it's plausible that the long white form is the side of a book, which sits on a book stand, and that the hand is on the book's page, and hopefully the diagram on the left makes that clear. Under the microscope, the pink chasuble lining, orange-red hand, white book, and brick-red bookstand are blended wet and wet, which means they are part of a continuous first campaign. Soon after the hand on the page of the book was painted in, it was repositioned to its final place on the chest. This hand was subsequently painted over in the same position, this time with shortened fingers, the red sash painted over the tips. The sash from the first campaign used to be a lighter red and in a slightly different position, as can be seen through the loss. The proper left hand has been changed as well, from bare to gloved. This can be seen in X-ray and was confirmed with cross-sections which show flesh-colored paint underneath the upper paint layers. The color of the glove was also changed from a dark beige to red. The others also display both pentimenti and repaint. Like Pope Gregory, St. Augustine has another hand with longer fingers beneath the uppermost paint layer. The hand with longer fingers is blended into a gray layer. This gray layer seems to extend beneath the whole of St. Augustine's red garment, which means that is either an underlayer or that the robe may have been gray in the first campaign. The flesh of the boy to the right of St. Augustine has also been repainted, and there is evidence that the boy used to be unclothed in the first campaign, only wearing a mantle like in the engraving. This is seen in X-ray and in infrared. The boy's mantle also used to be a deep red, painted with red lakes, as seen through losses. In X-ray, a backrest of the finial is visible on the right-hand side, now hidden beneath a brown background. The presence of this backrest means that St. Augustine was once more consistent with the other two paintings, which also have backrests. It also makes the painting more similar to the engraving. In infrared, it's apparent that St. Jerome's fur cuffs were added at a later date. The lion was also repainted. It used to look a lot more naturalistic. The IR image also shows that the position of St. Jerome's proper right hand and quill have been minorly adjusted during the painting stage, which can also be seen in X-ray below. The X-ray also shows another position of the hand located closer to the face. In addition, St. Jerome's head used to be larger and wider and was tilted in a slightly more downward position, as can be seen in the diagram on the left. In a cross-section taken from St. Jerome's red robe, a buildup of opaque vermilion with a red lake glaze on top can be seen twice. This means that the red garment was repainted. Unlike the changes to Pope Gregory's drapery, this repainting is not related to a compositional change, and there is no evidence of significant damage in the first campaign of drapery to explain the need for repainting. Although the analysis has produced a complex picture, each of the paintings display first a campaign that includes pentimenti, shortly after which there were repaintings. We can conclude that the pentimenti within the initial composition seem to have been concentrated on changing the placement of objects, while the repaintings cover whole passages and do not change the painting greatly. The repaintings do not look to have been prompted by damage to the first campaign, and in fact, the upper campaign seems a lot less resilient. This begs the question, why might have the repaintings been undertaken? This will be explored in just a few minutes. But first, I'm going to speak a little bit about the supports. The Fathers of the Church are painted on English oak panels. Each is constructed from 3 vertically oriented butt-joined boards. Dendrochronological analysis found that the boards of St. Augustine and Pope Gregory are from one tree, felled in 1563, and the tree is from the area of Worcestershire. St. Jerome's boards were tangentially cut, so there were not enough tree rings to analyze. Board A of St. Augustine was found to have come from the same tree as I and H of Pope Gregory. Board B of St. Augustine matches to the G board of Pope Gregory, and the C board of St. Augustine is similar looking to the wood of the St. Jerome panel. Although a felling date can usually help with the understanding of when a painting was made, the dating of the set is complicated by the fact that the boards were found to have been repurposed. Here, hopefully you can see small pegs in the St. Augustine and Pope Gregory panels. The pegs serve no function for the paintings, as they go straight through the front of the boards at seemingly random places. This indicates that the boards were part of a 3-dimensional object, like a table or chest. The pegs would have attached the boards to perpendicular members. The pegs in some of the boards also match up to one another, which means that the boards have been cut across the grain for use as a painting support after having been part of a different object. The boards of St. Jerome also show evidence of reuse. We can see here exposed half-dowel channels. This means that in their previous use, the boards were about twice their thickness and joined together with dowels. Since the half-dowel channels don't continue across the current board joins, this means that they were in a different orientation or even joined to different boards. Usually panel paintings were finished on the back with bevels at the edges, but in this case, they are none. Each panel has a barb at the edge of the painted area and an unpainted border around the perimeter measuring about 2 centimeters. This suggests that they were painted in an engaged frame. They could also have been painted into wall paneling. If the paintings were inset into paneling, this means they might have been painted directly onto the wall in situ, making these a decorative work, and linking their making directly to Chastleton House. Here are some examples of some large 16th and 17th century religious wall paintings on panel. So how else might the paintings be linked to Chastleton House? It has been previously posited that the Fathers of the Church are stylistically similar to another set that is indigenous to the house, the Sibyls and Prophets frieze, which date to the early 17th century. 5 of the 24 paintings were examined in person at Chastleton, and there were some notable similarities to support this claim. In general, the green, red, and brown color palette of the Prophets and Sibyls, with rare instances of blue, look similar to the Fathers of the Church. The eyebrows of the Prophet Isaiah and the lion in St. Jerome have a similar shape. The Prophet Isaiah's gaunt face and downward-facing eyes, made with simple brushstrokes, look like those in St. Augustine. The sparse curls of hair on the top of Isaiah's head and the blue highlight on his saw also look like those elements seen in St. Jerome. And the writing on the tablets of Moses is illegible, much like that in the books of St. Augustine and St. Jerome. The decorative shapes on the sleeve of the Persian Sibyl looks like those of the chasuble of Pope Gregory. The eyebrow of the Cumaean Sibyl is painted with similar upward strokes that blend into the flesh, which can also be seen in St. Augustine and Pope Gregory. If these sets were in fact painted by the same artist, this would place the paintings in Chastleton House around the same time it was built. However, Sharon Tager's technical analysis of the Prophet and Sibyls in 2001 shows that despite all the similarities in style, their palettes differ. Notably, Tager found smalt in many of the paintings, where none was found in the Fathers of the Church. This may indicate that the two sets were not in fact painted by the same artist or workshop. However, the possibility can't be fully discounted, as out of the 25 samples I took during my project, only 6 were analyzed with SEM-EDX due to time constraints. A more comprehensive elemental analysis of the pigments might find more links between the palettes of the two sets. Another way to help understand the context of the set is to look at the visual culture of the time. What images were allowed to be made and displayed in post-Reformation England? The English state's position on religious images was largely up for debate from 1569 to 1660, and the state's mandates also differed in practice. There was a spectrum of belief. On one extreme were people who officially converted to Protestantism but privately practiced Catholicism, and on the other were Puritans who sought further reform. The main issue was the use of the image. Religious images were permissible if used as teaching devices, but not for worship. They were officially banned from churches, but not from the home. In the 6th century, Pope Gregory likened images to books for the illiterate. This is an explanation that the established church supported, but there was a fear that religious imagery would be worshipped. This was reflected in the emphasis on the second commandment. The 10 commandments were often reproduced in churches instead of images, as seen in the prior slide. Religious scenes that told a story in order to inform the viewer intended to be more accepted, like the image of Cain and Abel and Dean House. If the Fathers of the Church set was intended as part of a telling of history, this might explain their presence in the house. The subject matter of portrait sets in Tudor and Jacobean eras was usually historical and mirrored the elite public's interest in national history, which was seen in other areas, like literature and theater. Therefore, Catholic images within portrait sets didn't always reflect the patron's allegiance to Catholicism, but were meant to help illustrate important events that led to the Reformation. The Brown Gallery portrait set at Knowle House, for example, includes John Wycliffe, a Catholic theologian and philosopher, and various bishops. I pointed out the differences between the prints and the paintings in the beginning of this presentation. A possible explanation for these differences is that they were included in an effort of recusancy. Recusants were people who refused to recognize the established church or did not attend church services. One could argue that the Catholic sympathies were hidden with small changes to the attributes of each saint. But does St. Jerome's missing hat really make him look less like a cardinal, and the change to Pope Gregory's staff make him look less like a pope? I think not. Moreover, the added crucifixions would have been considered idolatrous. And the addition of wings to the boy in St. Augustine, which would make him an angel, would also have been disapproved of by the established church. Images with invented elements that went beyond descriptions provided by biblical texts were labeled false and lying deceptions that were thought to cause believers to stray away from the truth of God. The fact that individuals are depicted alone in this set might have been unacceptable too, as Protestant reformers argued that these images were more evocative of a real person stood before the viewer, thus encouraging their worship. The clothing added to the boy, as well as the skull and clock, however, are typical imagery in the Protestant household. The clock and skull are symbols of memento mori, a reminder to meditate on mortality, even during the prime of life. Images of memento mori featured in Protestant homes to remind the patron to be prepared for judgment after death. These images were especially important because at this time there was an emphasis on the Calvinist idea of predestination, the belief that whether an individual reaches heaven is not up to their actions, but up to fate. Another explanation for the presence of the added elements is that they could simply be the result of the artist having used different features from many print sources to inform each painting. For example, a set of 4 Spanish colonial works, an example of one is seen here on the right, are an amalgamation of different versions of the Martin de Vos designed engraving. And 2 other sets of engravings based on the de Vos design were found during this project, a set by Jacques Grandhomme and a set by Thomas Deleu. The multiple campaigns of painting and the reused wood complicate the set's dating and placement within the house. Since the paintings are based on print sources, the earliest date they had to have been created was 1565. However, they were likely to have been used in England from around the 1590s to the early 1600s, with the publishing of compiled books of prints. This is supported by the fact that portrait sets became popular starting in the 1590s. If the set was painted in situ into paneling, then this could indicate that they were painted for Chastleton House in the early 1600s. But since the boards are second-use timber that date to 1563, they could have come from a different property. And at that time, they may not have even been paintings, but pieces of furniture. This adds to the difficulty in understanding when each of the campaigns were painted. The initial paintings may very well predate the house and could have been repainted once at Chastleton in order to unify the decorative scheme. This would explain the uppermost layer matching stylistically to the Prophets and Sibyls set, which would date the paintings to 1613, making at least the uppermost campaign indigenous to the house. Hopefully this project has added detail and clarity to a set that had little technical or art historical research associated with it previously. More technical analysis can be done, especially on the cross-sections, to find additional links between the two Chastleton sets. And more archival work can be undertaken to confirm how the prints may have reached England, specifically in the books compiled by Thomas Trevelyan. This set would also be a great candidate for macro XRF analysis, which could help to visualize the multiple campaigns of painting. Still, close observation with the naked eye and under normal light was the most integral tool for parsing out the complicated relationship between the set's campaigns. I would like to thank the many people who helped bring this project into fruition. A special thanks to the National Trust and my project supervisor, Peppa Balch, as well as the conservators at Ebury Street. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. So just to remind everyone that we are doing a 20 minutes Q&A session after all three speakers have spoken. And so feel free to pop any questions you have into the chat room, and the speakers will answer them when it's time for questions. So next up, we have Kendall Francis from the Courtauld Institute. She is going to present her work on an investigation into the materials and techniques of Willem van de Velde the Younger, centering on the examination of the royal visit to the fleet in the Thames estuary in 1672 at the National Maritime Museum, Greenwich.
Right, thank you, Siwei. Let me just try and share this screen. Hello? Hello?
Hi, Kendall. We can hear.
Oh, sorry. Okay, sorry, I'm having a bit of trouble finding the presentation to share when I say share screen. Oh, hold on, no, done it. Hello everyone, my name is Kendall Francis and I'm a third-year student studying a postgraduate diploma in easel painting conservation at the Courtauld Institute of Art. Thank you and welcome to this presentation on my thesis study into the materials and working methods of the 17th century Dutch maritime painter Willem van de Velde the Younger. There has been very little to no technical examination carried out on Van de Velde the Younger's work, and as the National Maritime Museum Greenwich houses one of the largest collections of paintings by the artist, the aim of this technical investigation was to begin establishing this understanding by examining 8 paintings from his English oeuvre at the museum. As a result, this highlighted interesting variations in the Younger's methods and materials in the painting The Royal Visit to the Fleet in the Thames Estuary, 5th of June 1672. In addition, as the working relationship between the younger is so closely linked to his father, Willem van der Velde the Elder, and their drawing practice, this study examined and compared 4 oil paintings by Willem van der Velde the Elder and a select sample of drawings associated with the paintings to discover how their production methods played a role in the artistic process of the younger. As this thesis study involved many different aspects of investigation and comparison, this talk today will focus primarily on the technical examination on the royal visit and highlight the interesting variations in its unusual ground and underdrawing techniques. I will concentrate principally on an offset reconstruction process to demonstrate how van der Velde the Younger used his drawings to facilitate his paintings, continuously making links to studio practice and his relationship with his father's drafts. Little is known about the early years of Willem van der Velde the Younger, but to understand the progression of the Younger as a painter, one must begin with his working partner and father. Willem van der Velde the Elder was a prolific Dutch maritime draftsman and would accompany Dutch naval fleets to record ships and battles. He was famed for his black and white pen painting style and was commissioned by Dutch and international admiralty and royalty. Although blessed with an exceptional ability for accurate sketches, the elder had very little aptitude for oil painting, so when his son showed great promise with a brush, you can probably imagine the dollar signs like flashing in his eyes, Willem van der Velde the Younger was compelled to become an accomplished painter. By the age of 18, we know the Younger was put under the tutorship of marine painter Simon de Vlieger, and then by the age of 20 was first documented as a painter and assistant to his father in their Amsterdam studio. It is here the Younger established his role in the studio, putting his father's drawings into colour, and this is an important factor in his progression as an artist. Van der Velde became the most sought-after name to own a maritime painting by, but due to religious upheaval in the Netherlands in the late 16th century, in 1672 the Van der Veldes emigrated to England to the delight of King Charles II, who gave them the official patronage of the crown just under a year later. The official warrant of their patronage still survives, and the text demonstrates the two artists selling their skills as one, both equal in pay, father as draftsman and son as painter. But it is, quote, the Younger putting the said drafts into colour, end quote, which emphasises his dependent relationship with his father's drafts. The Van der Velde studio has an extensive portfolio of thousands of drawings, and 2 contemporary portraits of Van der Velde the Younger demonstrates his recognition towards the vital role that his father's drawings played in his artistic career. On the left, he is seen holding his father's drawing and pointing towards his signature, and on the right, you can see a portfolio of his father's drawings just sprawled across the floor as he paints. The reason for why the portfolio of drawings by the Van der Velde studio is one of the biggest of any workshop is due to the process of offsetting used in the studio. As he never accompanied his father on voyages, back in the studio the Younger had to rely on adapting his father's drawings. This was made possible through the practice of drawing with graphite and taking offsets from the original to create multiple images. The technique was performed by placing a moist sheet of paper on the graphite drawing and rubbing the back of the original to transfer part of the graphite to the new sheet. These were then worked up with graphite and ink, adding different ornamentation, sails, and altering the shape and architecture for different ships for other paintings. You can see this here in the example of the portrait of the Portsmouth, which are 2 offsets made by the Younger from the same original graphite drawing and worked up differently. The original drawing was most likely discarded because of damage. To ingratiate themselves into the English court, the royal visit was a royal commission, most presumably for King Charles II. It depicts the king conducting a council of war upon the ship the Royal Prince after the Battle of Solbay against the Dutch. It is understood the younger arrived first in London and began the painting alone, yet he did not witness this event on the Thames or the battle itself. His father, though, was in attendance at the battle and sketched the event from the side of the Dutch. Therefore, the younger must have utilised his father's drawings of the battle and ships to compose the scheme. This study has found a critical part of the younger's practice for larger works was to create preliminary sketches from his father's drawings and ship models to correctly compose the realistic movements of the vessels, sails and flags in relation to the wind, and to then compose an oil sketch to ensure important features like flag colour, which symbolises particular ensigns and royalty, were correct. In the large collection of drawings at the National Maritime Museum, Greenwich, there is a graphite and ink study of the same subject, and in the collection of the National Gallery of Ireland, there is a smaller oil-painted version. Both are identical to each other in composition and size and have the same differences to the final painting, such as the omittance of the Admiralty flag in the mizzen, an important symbolic feature. These differences suggest they are the preliminary designs. With a design composed, Van der Velde the Younger was ready to begin on the large canvas, which is a single piece of close weave herringbone linen. You can see it has the blue indigo lines running horizontally, identifying the material as ticking. Interestingly, there are some similarities between this canvas ticking and the one used for the equestrian portrait of Charles I by Anthony van Dyck in 1638, but this is another discussion. The canvas was primed with 3 oil-bound pigmented ground layers. Cross-section analysis and inorganic examination with SEM-EDX revealed the first layer is a homogeneous red-brown colour and the second and third ground layers are grey. This exact priming method is documented by de Mayerne in his contemporary manuscript. Interestingly, he obtained this customary 17th century priming method from a professional primer in London. An analysis conducted on the preparatory grounds of the 11 other paintings in the study indicated that the Van der Veldes purchased pre-primed standard-sized canvases in England. Analysis also showed there is a correlation between the size of the painting, the weave type and the ground colour, but again this is another topic in itself. The most curious aspect of the priming method of the royal visit is the third unusual blackish-grey priming layer, which this study has not found anywhere else in the younger English oeuvre. And you can see it is very apparent through areas of abrasion in the paint layers. It was commonplace for artists to add another priming layer if they needed, and the larger, less well-ground particles of the carbon black and glass in this third layer, seen here, here and here, could indicate that Van der Velde the Younger applied this himself, perhaps requiring a more brooding mood for the painting. Ultimately, the dark tonality of the ground then required the Younger to alter his underdrawing methods for the composition to be distinguishable. Infrared examination of the royal visit and the 7 other paintings by the Younger in this study indicated he did not use a carbon-containing medium for his underdrawings. Microscopic examination of the 7 other paintings revealed a consistent use of a thin brown painted underdrawing, and it appears to be the regular method used by the Younger on his standard ground colours, and you can see this these brown lines in the example here on the pinkish buff ground colour from the Mary yacht. He also employed this technique to draw in subjects on top of sky passages, and he used this technique in the royal visit, and you can see this here for the background boat that has been placed on top of the sky passage. However, these brown lines would not have been discernible on the black ground. Yet he knew where the composition was going to be placed, as the Osiris and microscopy pictures here shows the sky passage was painted first, and reserves were left for major and smaller vessels, sails and the flags. So how did Van der Velde the Younger apply his underdrawing? There exist two offset drawings in a previously unidentified medium, which are mirror images of two areas of the composition. The first offset is an exact reverse of the kitchen in the Boymans Museum collection, but this was inaccessible. And the second is an exact reverse of the French ship's barge signed by the Younger and in the Fitzwilliam Museum, Cambridge. And this drawing was available for close examination. Previous thought about the Fitzwilliam drawing was that it was an offset taken from the painted level. However, this study has proved it was indeed taken from the underdrawing. To examine the drawing, a Mellon-X tracing was made of the French ship's barge from the painting and placed over the drawing for exact comparison. They matched up reasonably well, however the offset drawing is smaller overall and there are many differences, such as the bottom half of the white flag is completely omitted, which indicates that this offset was taken from a preliminary image from the underdrawing. Remarkably, you can also see there are small parallel lines in various areas of the offset. The Mellon-X tracing from the painting included the pattern of the weave, and when compared to these lines in the drawing, shows they do in fact correspond exactly to the herringbone canvas, and it is this evidence which confirms the drawing is an offset taken from the underdrawing stage, as the pattern of the weave would have been prominent enough to imprint. To prove this compelled the creation of two reconstructions of this area of the painting to test the offsetting process used by Van der Velde the Younger. This process aimed to confirm that the offset drawing was indeed taken from the underdrawing stage, to identify the medium used for the offset and perhaps the underdrawing, and to gain a better understanding of the process and the reasons for why they were created. The replicas were made following as close as possible to the methods and materials of the original painting, gathered from technical analysis with additional instructional help from the previous reference in the de Mayen manuscript. A comparable herringbone linen canvas was stretched and then sized with 2 layers of rabbit skin glue. Pigments and chalk were ground in linseed oil, and the first reddish-brown ground layer was applied. Once this was dry, as instructed by the de Mayen manuscript, this layer was smoothed down with a pumice stone, and then the second and third grey layers were applied, paying careful attention to ensure that the final shade was consistent with that of the blackish grey of the original. Canvas number 1 was left at this priming stage to replicate the transfer process from the underdrawing, and canvas number 2 was painted with the same depiction of the French ship's barge to replicate the transfer process from the painted surface. The next stage of investigation then required the identification of the medium used to offset the drawing. The medium for both offset drawings have not been scientifically identified, but the catalogue entries note either a reddish-brown chalk or a thick brown ink. The material has a chalky appearance in some areas, which gives the illusion of drawn lines, yet in others the medium is deeper and more saturated, and has the impression of a liquid medium used with a brush. The material sits on top of the paper with minimal bleeding, and a grey wash has also been later added for shading which has disturbed the material in some areas, yet the material is uninterrupted in others. Microscopic analysis of the medium conducted during this study by paper conservators at the Fitzwilliam and the Courtauld have suggested that the characteristics of the material are akin to bister. Bister is an organic pigment which has been used as an artist material since the 17th century and is made by collecting soot from burning wood, boiling it until thick, and filtering the residue. Research conducted found documentation of Dutch artists adding sanguine or red chalk to bister to create warmer, more reddish browns. Other contemporary counterproof methods from painting showed that there were recipes using earth pigments and egg white, rabbit skin glue or water, painted onto the surface of a painting and transferred onto damp paper or turpentine-soaked paper. So, as a result, this study chose to replicate the transfer process with these 5 materials: red chalk, earth pigments, bister, bister with red chalk, and bister with red ochre. The red chalk and earth pigments were tested in 3 different binders: water, rabbit skin glue, and egg white. The transfer methods included dry paper, damp paper, and turpentine soaked paper from both canvas number 1 and 2. The tests on canvas number 1, with only the ground priming, were carried out with the word van or veld, and tests on canvas number 2 were carried out by going around areas of the painted composition. The different medias were either drawn or painted with a brush. Offsets were transferred onto comparable traditional hand-laid paper of the same weight and texture as the original, and all tests were burnished on the back with a plastic tool. After each offset was taken, a grey wash of diluted Indian ink was brushed over the transfer to replicate the original shading and compare the effect on the material. The results of the tests showed that the offset drawing was most effectively reproduced with bister combined with red ochre, transferred using slightly damp paper from canvas number 1. The combination resulted in a strong transferred image with a comparable reddish-brown colour to the original. Areas where the paper was drier resulted in a chalky drawn appearance and the medium sat on top of the paper. Damper parts of the paper, or thicker areas of the bister mixture, resulted in darker and more saturated brush lines. The herringbone pattern was the closest in appearance to the original offset drawing and only needed gentle burnishing. Although there was some evidence of the weave pattern in the bister offsets taken from canvas number 2, this did require very hard burnishing and it was at the peril of the painted surface. The bister and red ochre mixture was disturbed by the ink when the wash was added only a few hours after, but when the medium had dried for over a week, it was undisturbed by the wash. So, this process and evidence indicated that the offset was indeed taken from the underdrawing stage. But what it also demonstrated was that the addition of the red ochre to the bister made the underdrawing much clearer and more perceptible on the black ground. For this reason, it signalled that the underdrawing itself was done in a bister and red ochre medium. To see if this was in fact used for the underdrawing, cross-sections were taken from areas of loss in the French ship's barge which correlated to the offset drawing, and thus where the Bista underdrawing would most likely be. Two cross-sections taken from here and here successfully confirmed a reddish-brown organic layer in between the ground and paint layers. And what's more is this layer was found in a cross-section taken from the edge of the stern of the Royal Prince, in an area where underdrawing should be present. This layer in all three cross-sections exhibits the same characteristics, fluorescing dark in ultraviolet light and appears to contain organic material. A recent investigation into the scientific characterization of Bista samples using XRF for inorganic components showed that potassium, calcium and iron are the main elements present in Bista, and this is very comparable with EDX analysis conducted on all three of these samples. But due to the complexity of the material, inorganic analysis techniques like EDX and XRF can be problematic. Therefore, this study is analysing this layer using the organic analysis technique FTIR at the National Gallery, London, with the hope to characterise the organic components of Bista. Finally, what was the purpose of this offset drawing? In the large corpus of drafts, there is no evidence of a Bista offset like that of the French ship's barge or the kitchen to date. Tantalisingly, although some of the graphite drawings are very similar sizes to the paintings, like the example here from the drawing and painting of the Resolution by Van der Velde the Younger, there has been thus far fruitless attempts by all academics, past and present, to find exact mirror images to the Younger's paintings. But as the Younger and the studio was no stranger to the offsetting process and constantly used it in daily studio life, it could be reasoned that the purpose of this offset from the underdrawing was to be used as an instructional drawing to be adapted for different paintings. This may possibly have been a standard practice for the Younger, to first take a graphite offset drawing from his father's original, work these up for his compositions, and then apply this design onto the primed canvas with Bista and red ochre, and to then take an offset transfer from his underdrawing as a record eye, and to then rework and alter the design into a graphite drawing, and the original Bista offset would be damaged and discarded. This constant cycle of transfer and alteration would result in many drawings being discarded, and the surviving ones would look similar but not identical to the paintings. Or, on the other hand, this is most likely could have been Van der Velde the Younger experimenting on an underdrawing medium he had not previously used. Further analysis on the underdrawing medium on a wider range of his paintings would be greatly beneficial to determine if the Younger used Bista underdrawing in any of his other works, or if this medium was exclusively used for the royal visit. It would also help to record the ground colours he used to determine if the dark ground seen here is not just an anomaly. It would also be valuable to conduct organic analysis on the Fitzwilliam offset drawing and compare this, along with the investigation in this study, with examination on the Boymans Museum offset to see how the two relate to each other and to the painting. So I'd like to say a huge thank you to all these people and organisations here, that without each of them this project would not have been a success. Namely Sarah Maisie, the painting servitor at the National Maritime Museum, who facilitated absolutely every need for this project, even down to the coffee. And my project supervisor, Claire Richardson, whose support and encouragement throughout this project is forever appreciated. So thank you. And thank you for listening, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you.
That was fabulous. Now I would like to have all the speakers turn on their camera so we can have a discussion. and answer any questions people might have. And Alex?
My camera has been blocked from being turned on.
Oh. Let's see if that can be.
Oh. Okay, great.
Okay, cool. Yay! Hi. Fantastic presentations, everyone. And now I would like to start a question for Alex. So did you manage to look through both of those compiled books of prints to get an idea of whether the Peter Courtauld prints were actually in any of them?
Yeah, so I did manage to look through the Thesaurus of 1585. There's a catalog called the Holstein catalog, which has reproductions of the prints. And I didn't find any that, I found ones that were actually a couple of different sets of the Fathers of the Church after Martin de Vos, but they were by different printmakers and not in the same sort of compositional format as the Peter Courtauld prints. And they were also in a horizontal format. So if you remember the picture of that thesaurus, it's a kind of wide horizontal format. And the Peter Courtauld prints that these paintings are after are in a vertical format. The prints and both the book, the thesaurus and the Trevelyan miscellany book have a height of 29 centimeters. So the prints could have been in each of those books, but because of the vertical format, it's likely that it was actually that the prints were in the Trevelyan book, which I didn't get to have the chance to look through during the project. So which would sort of more firmly place the paintings, if they were based from a compiled book of prints, it would firmly place them in the 17th century. Yeah, hope that answers the question.
That was great, thank you. And a question for Kendall. So was leaving reserves in the sky a usual technique for Velde the Younger?
Yeah, it was a usual technique. There was quite a bit of collaboration in the studio, and to understand how to paint ships in relation to the wind and to the sea is a very precise thing to understand, and Velde the Elder and the Younger were exceptional in knowing this. So when they would apply their underdrawing and leave the reserves for sails, it would then allow other people in the workshop to go along and paint the sails, which are kind of more easier bits to paint, and then know the shape and how they're moving against the wind. So yeah, it was a studio kind of practice for them to do that. And quite interestingly, because there was a reserve left for the Royal Prince, which is the ship, the large ship on the right hand side, there's evidence to show that there's been an added kind of working from later on by the studio due to a reserve that hasn't been left for the figurehead, which is the front part of the ship. So the fact that hasn't been, there's no reserve for that, shows that there's been added painting by the workshop at a later date. So that's quite interesting. So yeah, it's revealed a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We have a question for Rachel. So what are the codes of ethics regarding the removal of overpaints that you have come across?
Okay, perfect. So with regards to the removal of overpaint, the codes of ethics are not clear. They do set a standard for conservation disciplines in general, but not exactly for just paintings or overpaintings. So it is hard to come across statements which can be followed. However, ICON does state that no aspect of cultural property should be altered without justification, which would suggest removal. Then again, it also states that no material should be removed without justification, which states a bit of a... also, justification itself can be a subjective aspect. So it's not so clear with regards to how we should move forward. Also in another code, ICON does state that restoration should not modify the aesthetic and physical character of cultural objects. So this would suggest that the overpaint must be removed. So considering how vague the codes tend to be, it may be a safe bet to consider holders, and also to make sure that the overpaint can be removed without causing any damage and without requiring extensive reconstruction, which would interfere with future analysis due to the tampering of the materials which are added through reconstruction. So that's what I have.
No, that's excellent. I think we still, thank you, Rachel. I think we still have time for a few more questions. And for Alex, the connection to the Sybil set is very interesting. Do you know if any further research is likely?
As of right now, I'm not sure, but I would love to continue to research the connection between the two Chastleton sets. I think it's very likely that they might be painted by the same artist or workshop. In terms of the palette, it would be great to continue to analyze the cross sections I took. It's likely that the smalt in particular, the smalt was used in just a particular place in the Sybil set, so that might in the kind of roundels, so it might not actually discount the fact that they are that they're clearly connected, but there were a few more differing pigments that sort of raised up a bit of a red flag. They are so similar stylistically though that I think that it's I don't have too many doubts about them being connected. I would love to be able to continue to research them, maybe sometime in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. And just before we break for lunch, I think I have one more question for Kendall. So did William van der Velde the Younger make any prints? If so, did you have a chance to explore how their printmaking techniques related to the drawing painting technique, specifically regarding the offsetting technique?
No, I don't think they actually made prints. I know that Van der Velde the Elder, during his early years as an artist in Amsterdam, started off as a graphic designer for printmakers. So he knew of the kind of techniques that we used during the printmaking kind of process. So obviously he employed that with the offsetting kind of practice in the studio with the graphite drawings. But I know that there's a lot of prints after their paintings by other artists. Courtauld, I think was his name, made quite a few prints, and they're actually in the British Museum after the royal visit. So there's a lot of prints after by other artists, but not by the artists themselves. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Kendall.
Thank you.
I think that might be all we have time for today for the second panel. And thank you so much, Kendall, Rachel, and Alex again. And we will take a lunch break of about 40 minutes. I think we will meet back here at 1:30 for the third panel. So thank you everyone a bit.